I wouldn't trust anything that Bruno Latour says, first of all.
Sure.
I mean, it's just ridiculous, that guy. The main difference between Bruno Latour, the two things might seem similar, but they are not. And for one specific reason, one specific concept is the concept of relationships of exteriority versus relationships of interiority. Let me explain what that means. Hegel invented relationships of interiority, which means relations that constitute the very identity of what they relate. So when two things are related in interiority, they don't have their own separate identities. Their identity is established in the whole. Right? This is why Bruno Latour typically fuses things like techno-science, because what he wants to say is neither technology nor science exist independently of their relationship. Now, relationship of interiority began by Hegel, were adopted by all the German philosophers of nature, Schelling and Goethe and so on in the 19th century. They were adopted by Husserl and Heidegger. They were adopted by Merleau-Ponty. They were adopted by Varela and so on. And so they are still there. They are the relationships talked about by Bruno Latour. The problem with that is that the wholes that the parts constitute when you have relationship interiority is a seamless whole. It's a seamless totality that you cannot analyze it anymore. You cannot analyze it because the parts did not have an independent existence to begin with. So the whole world becomes one big block of agencies, modifying one another and creating each other's identities. I don't buy that at all, right? And Deleuze, of course, came out swinging against that stuff because his very first book ever was a book on Hume, who introduced relationship of exteriority, extrinsic relations, things that, things are related, but they don't constitute the identity of what they relate. So for instance, a causal relationship is a relationship of exteriority. The knife has its own identity, the cheese has its own identity, but then they can interact and for the event to cut and to be cut when the knife is cutting the cheese. But after you finish cutting, the cheese is cheese and the knife is knife. They did not become fused into an inextricably related totality. That word, inextricably related, you're going to find it in Latour all over the place. Right? They love to say that. Oh, that's inextricably related. Inextricably. Oh my God. Well, as long as it's inextricably, it must be true. Right? That is an invention of German philosophers. It doesn't exist. The only place in the world where relationships of interiority exist is in social conventions. For instance, the rules of chess, which determine the identity of the queen and the king and their relationships to the board and their relationships to each other, do constitute the identity of the pieces of chess. There's no question about that. But then they go, and this is, of course, the linguistic turn, the making everything into language. They go, well, if in language we can have constitutive relations, intrinsic relations, then let's project all those into the world of action, into the world of the body, into the world of war, into the world of science, which is, of course, a bad move, right? So the only problem with Hume is that when you have relationships of exteriority, you may end up with just an agglomeration of things. So you need to enrich Hume with the concept of emergence. You need to say from the extrinsic relations, from the extrinsic interactions between components, a new property, a property of the whole emerges that is not in the parts and characterizes the whole. Otherwise, exteriority becomes reductionism. And this is what Hegel complained about in his book, The Logic of Science, or the Science of Logic, I'm sorry. That if you use relationship of exteriority, then everything is just an agglomeration, a bringing together of disparate things without any synthesis. But today we know that that is not true. You can have synthesis and you can have irreducibility, while at the same time defending analyticity. In other words, an assemblage, which is the word I use to oppose to a Hegelian totality, is a whole that is irreducible because it has its own properties, but it is analyzable because the components did not fuse into the whole. They maintain their identity. So this is something that I do, and I've been doing it for many years, following Deleuze. It is basic. It is one of those basic distinctions, because otherwise things can seem very similar. Now let's go back to just one more point, to the word agency. I do agree that things have agency, but not obviously conscious agency, or agency that is deliberative or intentional agency. They have causal agency. They can affect and be affected by other things. Both the capacity to affect and the capacity to be affected are causal, right? And so, yes, the knife by itself, you might say that it has the capacity to cut by itself, even though there's not a user with a knife cutting, because if you mounted it in just the right way, and you then develop some kind of mechanical way of running the cheese under the knife, and then you left the room, the cheese running under the knife would still be caught, right? Would still be caught by the knife, despite the fact that there's no one actually using the knife, right? You did have to create the whole rig in order for that to happen. But nevertheless, before there were humans in the planet, there were already collisions of meteorites that were leaving craters, that were having a causal agency, that were doing things, right? So yes, I would agree that everything has a form of agency, as long as, number one, we do not think of that agency as intentional. Number two, as we don't think of that agency as producing seamless totalities in which everything affects each other at the same time and the whole world becomes a block universe. We have to keep things separate, because it is that separation that allows you to maintain the independence of the parts. Now, the parts themselves are made out of parts, which are made out of parts, which are made out of parts. And so at every level, reality is going to consist of many layers of emergence. The level of atoms, the level of molecules, the level of macromolecules like DNA, the level of cells, the level of tissues, the level of organs, the level of organisms, the level of ecosystems. Each one is a whole made out of parts, but no one fuses the parts into one thing.